with the intimate group we have here, now this was kind of, I had this kind of set up for a couple of potentially different things. Either we're going to have a room full of people, and we're going to do something more closer to a lecture-y sort of TED Talk kind of thing, or we're going to have a small group. We have a small group, and this is good because I intend to do this as a very interactive sort of way. There's questions are totally open. If somebody's asking something really silly, I'll tell you it's really silly. Go buy another beer. But the idea here with the big kind of macro idea of this is give you an idea how things work behind the scenes. I spent a large part of my 17 years in the FAA, and we'll go over some specifics here in a minute, as an analyst, analyzing things. Because when everybody thinks about aviation, they think about air traffic controllers, they think about airplanes and pilots. If you know somebody who knows something, they might think about an A&P mechanic or somebody who fixes airplanes or fixes stuff, but they forget entirely about the analytical power that goes behind all the stuff we do. The FAA's kind of got a unique charge. It has one and only one thing it has to do, and that's to ensure the safe and efficient use of the National Airspace System. That's all it does. Safe is first, efficient is second. To that charge, it does all of its work, and all the analysts do their work to make the best use of taxpayer money and to make the best decision on behalf of the public, so that the public gets what it needs with the money that's collected for it, and they basically tell everybody else to go pack sand. By way of background, I've got a whole lot of letters after my name, been an analyst, all that kind of stuff. I've been in the news, as Heather mentioned, about 30 times since January. I've become kind of that kind of unfortunate position where you're the best person at the worst time. When somebody wants to know, hey, how did these two dots run together on a radar screen? They call me to ask all about that. Now, before we run off too far, yes, aviation and flying commercially is still the safest mode of travel. You are in it much more likely to get hit by a car walking from here to where Cody's little red car is out there than you are to get hit in to die in an airplane crash. But I think it's important though, because there's a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of stuff that people don't understand, and we're going to touch on some of that as we go. I've also written tons of articles. Now, as we go through here, you're going to see this little QR code here because I am horrible at self-promotion, but this is just a thing to my LinkedIn. If you want to find my LinkedIn, it'll show up on some of the slides where it seemed to fit. But I am horrible with the self-promotion stuff, so just that's it. It's there. But if you're interested in kind of reading about some of that stuff, because I got into some of the articles, I get into nuance about how people's perceptions of travel how their perceptions of travel, say in a car, and they're hearing about airplane crashes on the news, how that makes them feel that air travel is not safe and that it's a materially dangerous thing. Articles about that. There's articles kind of explaining what happened in DC. And then there's some bunch of other things. I read a lot. I'm also a huge fan of cats. I love my cats. I like big cats. Cannot lie. But I have two Savannahs. Now, if anybody heard of a Savannah cat before? Yeah, they're big. They're big. Got my Sazerac, my little F4 on the wheel. He runs on that thing all day long. And then F4, lighting her, she's much more colorful than it looks on here. Maisie, she's an F2. I call her my Chonkosaurus. But they are the subject of many of my classroom lectures that we talk about, the risks and trials and hazards of having semi-wild animals in your house. And they're just fun to have around. So we're going to talk about a few things kind of this evening. And again, ask questions as you go. The idea of this presentation, the visuals up here, is this is not a script for me. This is not to handcuff anybody in. This is just kind of keep things moving a little bit. But if we have a good question and have a good story and kind of take a divert, we're going to get to the time and then we'll just wrap things up. I don't have a particular need to cover everything. I am more interested in entertaining you guys a little bit tonight, giving you some insights that maybe you don't already have, or maybe there's a question you're super curious about. The only things I want to have that kind of off limits would be like naming senators and stuff, and that will be more clear when we get there. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what it means to be an analyst in the government. I've talked about that a little bit, but they're like a unique species of animal, especially in the federal government. Local governments, for those of you who do in the nonprofit world, local governments, you're used to the personal relationships being a big part of what you do. If you're in sales, personal relationships are huge. In the federal government side, as an analyst, we had one particular job, is to not be anybody's friend. We don't like anybody, we don't hate anybody, we just don't. We care about what the numbers say and what the taxpayer need is represented by that. So you're kind of like on everybody's shit list. Nobody likes you, nobody invites you to Christmas, but everybody needs you when they need you. We got kind of three little stories I want to get into. We're going to talk about a senator being an idiot with the Syntex VOR. That was a decision about a particular navigation aid when a politician decided to stick their face in something, tried to ask for something they were not entitled to and should not have been asking about, and then gave us enough information to basically hammer them into the ground. We're talking about a major airspace change, and if it plays okay, that's a 13-year-old MacBook Pro, so it may or may not play okay, but I'm going to show you a transformation that we made in the airspace that was a huge, huge deal at the time and required 3 governments, several hundred companies, and about 4 analysts to do. Then we'll get into kind of the complexity of NAS. Now when we get to this part here about the complexity of NAS, now we're talking about current events. You will probably hear the name Duffy several times. But we're going to talk about what some of the current challenges are that have come to light because of DC's reaction to some of the stuff that's going on with the crashes and things like that. Because kind of one of the first confessions of an aviation analyst is you're always an aviation analyst. Even if it's not your job anymore, and anybody who does analytical work for a living, if that's part of who you are, that's part of who you are. You will see patterns, check data, analyze stuff, and although I've been out of that job for about 6 years, when I hear somebody say, hey, we want this policy to do this, the first thing I do is pull down a spreadsheet and start running some numbers. Hey, does this make sense? And then we'll kind of wrap some stuff up. But again, feel free to divert. This is just a little bit of a guide, how we're going to go. Now, you'll see me come over here for my water because one of the things that I am, on top of being an aviation analyst, I'm a project manager, and I'm one of about 15,000 risk certified people in the world for a particular type of certification I have. Water, laptop. So, any burning questions before we start? Maggie?
Just waiting on a server to come back and get a food order.
Nice. All right. All right. So, day in the life of an aviation analyst. So I started out talking a little bit about the analysts. They're kind of this like weird species of creature that lives somewhere in the cubicles in DC. DC, actually, the headquarters thing for an analyst is kind of an interesting thing because one of my jobs, one of the last jobs I had, I worked for Washington, DC. I worked for an office called AJI. It's the Office of Technical Training. My role was to create training for brand new radar systems that we had never actually brought online. We were creating a training while we're creating systems. Spent a ridiculous amount of time in Egg Harbor, New Jersey, because that's near Atlantic City Airport. That's where one of the FAA's 2 research centers is. They research systems in Atlantic City. They research people in Oklahoma City. Human factor stuff. So I spent a lot of time there. So Washington, when you're talking about headquarters and analysts and stuff like that, sometimes it's kind of weird because headquarters, you could work for headquarters and be just anywhere. In my case, because I was doing training stuff, I was part of a detached staff that worked at the FAA Academy in Oklahoma City where we train air traffic controllers, but I wasn't part of that organization anymore. I was literally just went across the street to another building and suddenly, poof, I was in DC. So analysts kind of live in that space, and that's distinct in the airspace, in a whole aviation kind of world. Aviation is a transportation industry, right? Everybody kind of see that? One of the things with transportation is you take stuff other places and you go other places. One of the big challenges with folks who want to be a pilot is you have to realize your job is to not be home, right? Well, most of the FAA works that way. Most of the FAA, if you're an air traffic controller, you work at a specific tower or you work at a specific radar center. If you are a pilot, a flight check person, you might say be based in Oklahoma City, but you're going to fly in your little airplane all over the world. If you're anywhere in management, anywhere in supervision, whatever, you are where your job is. But for the analysts, it could be anywhere. Maybe in Fort Worth, Texas, Seattle, whatever. Kind of just depends on where they've distributed the work at that point in time. And where somebody moved some boxes on an org chart because they didn't want to pay a relocation. That actually happened. Well, so most of our analysts, analysts are kind of behind the scenes people. Most of the analysts in the FAA, most of the analysts that work in that federal sort of space are what you think of an analyst. They've got an MBA, they've got a Master's of Public Administration, Public Policy, they're really good at statistics, they're really good at math, they can count numbers, they can do all the number crunchy stuff. In addition to that though, with the FAA, one of the peculiarities they have is every analyst in the FAA has some sort of expertise in air traffic, in airplanes, in my case, infrastructure, in something to do, something unique that the FAA does that nobody else does. Civil engineering. One analyst I worked with for several years, as we were doing requirements for buildings, our office was responsible for the whole middle third of the US. So picture every single airport and FAA structure from Canada all the way to Mexico, all the way down the middle third of the US. And there was me, who was the MBA technician, and then my buddy Carlos, who was an electrical engineer and a civil engineer. And then next to us, was our air traffic controller analyst, who everybody came from those different fields and we worked together. So the analysts work at this kind of interesting place where, like I mentioned before, you have to work with everybody's stuff, but nobody wants to work with you. You have to give people bad news kind of on the daily. Now, not bad news like, oh, there's a plane crash, but bad news like, sucks to be you, man, we're not funding that project. Or we recommend this, we recommend you put this in the stupid idea pile. Happen a lot. And it's that kind of interesting thing, because not only do you have to do the analytical work, not only do you have to get your job done, but you have to get your job done quite often in an environment where every single person you talk to is trying to fight you and trying to tell you to do something else. Anybody feel that, like, deep in their bones with where they are now? Derek?
Depends on the day.
Depends on the day. Yeah. It's in kind of just the Venn diagram of people we have here. That's probably more common, at least at the edge, than it is in most normal jobs. Most normal jobs, you go to a company, everybody's trying to accomplish the same thing. Yeah, you got your little cattiness inside, but nobody's really trying to change your budget and derail your entire office and possibly kick everybody you know out of a job because it fits their political agenda. And by political, I mean like seriously political agenda, not just, oh, it's something they want to do. But that's the space analysts live in. So that's part of the reason all the Title V protections exist in the federal code. Title V of the federal code is basically the employee handbook for federal employees. It's what the public thinks makes it impossible to fire somebody. It's really not. It's a protection so that an analyst can tell a senator to go sit in a corner and tell her, and they can't fire you for that as long as you've done your job well, as long as the story you're telling is a true story. As long as you're doing your work, nobody can fire you because they don't like the results of your work. Because as an analyst, your job is to, you analyze 3 out of 4 projects are a no-go. You just upset 3 out of 4 of the people you have to talk to. And that's kind of the daily. So, the analysts are all over the place. Everything we do has analytical work. There's flight safety people that manage flight safety systems, that record flight safety data. Aviation is kind of an interesting thing. Imagine that you had to have a absolutely complete, legally defensible record for every bit of maintenance and every kind of update you've ever done to your car. Like every time you put air in a tire, you had to log that and it had to go to a national database. Every time you rotated your tires, got an oil change, every time you had to replace your PCV valve in your engine, every time the sunroof got stuck, whatever it is, you had to have a record of it. Not only that, you also had to have a record of the part they put in and where it came from and where your old part went. So they replace your stereo, say, or replace your air conditioner. Like that exact piece of equipment by serial number is recorded, what happened to it, what replaced with, what actions did it take, all that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of data rich environment you're in, where every little action is tracked, every little action is reportable. Well, that means that we got to have a whole bunch of people that can interpret data that the average, sort of person person who's used to terrestrial travel, like cars and buses and stuff, doesn't even think that, because no other type of travel has that kind of record keeping. But every single bit of aviation has that kind of record keeping. You don't keep records on your commercial plane coming from Venezuela, that sucker lands here and they inspect it and you don't have the full set of records, that plane's going to get carried away in a box. Maybe they'll give you a waiver to have it take off, head directly over the Atlantic and head south and get out of US airspace. They will not let you fly that thing around if you don't have a complete record. Now, if you ever buy a plane that doesn't have a complete record, your very first stop is to have a mechanical group tear the whole thing apart and check to get a snapshot of what the current actual status is. For a commercial plane, that's a $100 million maintenance action. For a private plane, probably about $40,000 to $50,000. That's assuming you don't actually have to replace the engine. They're expensive. But you look at everything. As an analyst, you got to look at everything. You have to consider everything. Because again, the charge we have is making the best decision on behalf of the taxpayer. And our taxpayers need a safe and efficient national airspace system. So we got to think about the risks. We got to think about what's in place to mitigate the risks. What happens if the risk actually happens and we have to go to contingency mode? Who's affected, why they're affected, how they're affected. You have to think about things that a lot of people don't ever consider. This list could be huge because there are business cases I worked on and projects I worked on where we literally had to do noise studies over wetlands because certain levels of decibels would cause the protected birds there to stop laying eggs. So we had to see, okay, is this new air route we're planning on flying going to increase or reduce the amount of noise in that area and therefore affect this entire environmental thing and by extension the communities and things that are supportive of and are supported by that wetland and all that kind of stuff. So it's a huge job. But it's all done to get the best outcome for the public. Yes?
You mentioned parts. Is there tracking like that for fuel and oil and?
Well, they track usage. Consumables like fuel and oil is mostly tracked at the airline level, but the actual things that make up your plane, the parts and pieces and training and all that, that's all recorded. Any of the durable stuff is absolutely recorded. Yeah, they do log the exact amount of fuel that they load on a plane. In certain types of aircraft, they have to log exactly what tanks they put it in, because there's a thing called weight and balance with aircraft. If you're familiar with those, there was an Alaska Airlines tech problem a couple weeks ago that they shut down a whole bunch of flights, and then there was one here I think last week where they were talking about it was United Airlines that had a similar sort of problem. The system that was affected was their weight and balance system, and their weight and balance system, they have to, in bigger airplanes like that, they actually figure out where they're loading fuel, where they're loading baggage, how many passengers they have, and what they have to do is basically make sure that when the plane's flying, if say all craziness happens and the pilot passes out, the autopilot's not on, that the plane will tend to stay level or may pitch down. Now, pitching down sounds a little crazy, right? Why do I want a plane getting closer to the ground? Why would not want to go up? The problem is that when a plane goes up, it starts losing airspeed. And there's a point in time where every aircraft loses enough airspeed, it goes into what's called a stall. And when it hits a stall, the wings aren't flying anymore. You go from stall to fall. But you go down, you maintain airspeed. And they try to, obviously with the weight and balance, you don't want to go down too steeply, but that's the direction you kind of tilt it in. Make sure that it doesn't stall. Make sure that any conceivable balance of the plane is within the control limits of the pilot and the stick and all that kind of stuff. And that's all kind of underlying one of the things that's true in aviation is that every single rule like that, every single calculation like that, they say is written in blood. Because they didn't used to do, way back in the day, they didn't do really meticulous weight and balance calculations until they had a plane that flew and had a piece of cargo that slid to the back and the plane basically got pitched up and the pilot couldn't push it down hard enough. And if you got a box stuck in the back and there's, think like a smaller plane, you're not going back there to get it. It's in a whole different part of the plane. You're just going to crash. And that would really suck to find that out at like 30,000 feet. So you got a good 10, 15 minutes to think about that. But that's where all that kind of stuff comes out. You think about that, and that's why they track all the parts, so they can track if there is a crash like the DC crash in January. Every single history of every single part in both that Black Hawk and an American Airlines plane, every single piece of history for those has been scrutinized. Every minute of training for every flight crew person and even the flight attendants, the stewardesses, and that kind of stuff, that's all been tracked and scrutinized. That's part of how they found out recently that like they looked at the flight data and they looked at the maintenance history and stuff like that. That's why there's been a set of hearings with the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, and they were talking about one of the big challenges, because those hearings and things are all done with the idea of the investigations that they're not done with the idea of trying to find fault. They're done with the idea of let's make sure this doesn't happen again. And they found out that the Army has a known thing that the way their maintenance practices work on Blackhawks, they actually exceed the tolerance error allowed. But the Army's allowed to make its own call on that. It doesn't have to follow FAA rules. But their tolerances on their barometric altimeters actually exceed the tolerances allowed for that procedure. And they checked the ones that they pulled out in the flight data stuff on the one that they pulled out of the river. But then they went back and said, oh, well, it's this model, this type, and it's in this kind of aircraft. And they went and checked all the maintenance histories for the entire Army's fleet of helicopters, and they found out like that's pretty much all of them. It's pretty much all of them. Any given Black Hawk in those conditions, because it wasn't an anomaly. It was the normal condition of how those aircraft fly. And it's a different thing if it's a one-off thing and something broke, something was stuck, something wasn't working the way it was supposed to, versus now knowing you have a whole fleet of helicopters that are all broken the same way, and it's being allowed to continue like that. So those are huge, yeah. But that's part of why they track all the parts. So let's see, where are we here? Yeah, I went on this stuff here. Now, big thing is people side of analysts. Mention that you're always working with people that don't like you if you're an analyst. One of the challenges, one of the things that comes from, and there's a good parallel to this. When I used to work at the FAA Academy in Oklahoma City, one of my jobs for a while, I was one of these people who trained people coming to the academy to be an instructor. So I was an instructor trainer, I was a course designer, it was a pretty cool job. And it was really interesting because at that point, say I have a new air traffic controller coming in. One of the first things that I have to kind of beat into that person's head is, as of this moment, you are not an air traffic controller anymore. You are entering an entirely new trade. You're in an entirely new phase of your career where you are an academy instructor who used to be an operational air traffic controller. Could you be one again in the future? Probably, but you're not now. All that air traffic stuff and that expertise you built your whole life on to become one of the best ones that got selected for the academy. Interesting background, bud. Interesting background. Because you can't air traffic your way into being a good instructor. Different skill set. And that happens a lot as an analyst because you're the person who has to consolidate what all these experts really know. When you're talking to that air traffic controller who really is currently an air traffic controller, they are an absolute Viking in what they know. For their positions and their facility, they know everything. Every one of them knows everything if they're qualified, if they're fully qualified in position. So when you talk to them and you ask them what the job is, you can put money on it. Thing is, as an analyst, then I have to go over to my airway facilities person. So think a grounds technician. Think somebody who works on radar sites and stuff. I have to go to the airway facility person, so I might talk to this air traffic controller and say, hey, what does your radar scope look like? Long conversation there. Then I have to go to this radar person and say, hey, what are you putting on a radar scope? Both of those people think the other one doesn't know what they're talking about, and they're both busy trying to convince you that they don't need your job, you just need to get out of the way. Because what you're actually doing as the analyst is, job I already mentioned, I was then going to the New Jersey Research Center and looking at the training we were producing and saying, okay, we've had this little bit of a situation, or we've had this thing that we might want to optimize in our training so that we can reduce training time in the field, or maybe make it easy for people to stay current or whatever. Now I've got to give this to the engineers and training development people that are in New Jersey. Most of them have never been in the field. So I'm dealing with an air traffic controller who has never been out on a runway working on equipment, or never been out to a radar site. I'm working on a radar person who's probably not allowed in the tower. And then I have to go to work with the folks in New Jersey whose job is to create the next generation of the system. And I have to figure out how to filter through and how to work through the biases and the natural conflicts that happen between those people. It's a really good, really key function. I've long said that the best people to be an analyst in this kind of a job is really two kinds of people. There's a brand new MBA, somebody who isn't like invested in a certain career field or something. You know, because once somebody gets into finance, they're a finance person. And once they go into real estate, they're a real estate person. But if they're an MBA, they like just graduated, whatever, you know, pick your school, Penn State, whatever. They just graduated as an analyst or as an MBA. That's when they need to go be a government analyst. Any guesses what the other profession or the other sort of degree holder might be that would make a great analyst, given what I just talked about with the people? Those cats have different kinds of problems, But somebody who could work with those military people is on that list.
Psychologist.
What's that?
Psychologist.
A psychologist, exactly right. Exactly right. A psychologist, and some people might argue a child psychologist. But yeah, a psychologist, because they know how people work. Because the thing is, with the analyst, you don't ever have to be the expert in air traffic control. You don't ever have to be the person who knows how to fix a radar site. That may have been a previous job. I mean, I was a licensed radar technician. I fixed radar sites and generators, all that kind of stuff. But that was not what I was doing at that time. Just made it a little easier to talk to those people. But what I needed to be able to do was talk to all the other people and get them all on board and understand how they work and understand their quirks and biases and things like that. And yeah, it's a brand new MBA who knows how to do an analytics better than anybody in the world. And, you know, or a psychologist who knows how to get people to tell them what they need to know so that they can then hand it over to the person who's got the brand new MBA. The two best people in the world flat. So, on to the fun stuff. Now, you're going to see this a lot, this KCWK. This is the Syntex VOR. And I'll show you where it is in a second. It's in Texas. Anytime you see this K in front of something, it means it's in the US. You see a C, it's Canada. I don't know why we picked a K. I think it's the American car. But we picked it, and we got to pick a lot of things in aviation because we were first. Everything in aviation is done in English. No matter what country you're in, you can always call an air traffic control tower on the radio, and they will talk to you in English. Every pilot knows English. Now, they may not be awesome with English. They will know how to talk to the pilots and stuff. But aviation, English is the official language. Now, if you're overflying in Turkey and you speak Turkish and the air traffic control tower is speaking Turkish, then you may have a conversation in their native language or whatever. Same thing in Japan, whatever. But if you speak English and you fly into Japan, you will talk to them in English and they will talk to you in English. And then they're not going to be using Google Translate. So we see this a lot. Now, all these three little letters here always designate a facility. They always designate some kind of a facility, service, site, whatever. And they're not always the thing that's obvious. Does anybody know what the designation is for the local international airport here?
MDT.
MDT. Everybody calls it HIA, and that confuses the crap out of me. Because I think like these. I think it's KMDT. If I'm going to book an airline ticket from Harrisburg to Nashville, I'm going from KMDT to KBNA. I'm not going HIA to whatever they call Nashville's name. But this in aviation, it's got its own language like everybody else does. And if I put KCWK, everybody's going to know that's it. That's going to be an absolute impossible to get wrong reference for people. And that's why we do stuff like that. VOR is a particular system. It's a VHF, omnidirectional ranging. It's a system basically that sits in the middle of a field somewhere and essentially sends out, think of them as like invisible laser pointers out in space. And those laser pointers all describe a line of travel to or from that VOR. These things have been in service since 50s pretty safely. The technology to do it goes way back to like the birth of electronics, because Marconi, when he first came up with radio stuff, is the original principles were what created this. But we had this challenge. We had this Syntex VOR. At the time, the FAA was in this thing called NextGen, which is the modernization they're still doing right now. It's still running, which is as it would expect, and we'll see why that magnitude makes sense later. Any modernization for the FAA is going to take 20 or 30 years. There is no 3 or 4 year modernization. It is never going to happen. And that's mostly because of the magnitude of stuff and the decisions and things in play. In this particular case, we were looking at this Centex VOR because the FAA realized and was going through kind of an audit internally about how many of these systems were operating on a waiver. Basically, some part of them was broken, some part of them didn't work the way it was designed to work. This particular one had been on a waiver for 20 years. Now, totally fine. You know, the waiver made sense, the conditions, terms and conditions made sense, but they were trying to just get rid of these waivers. And basically this meant that we had a decision to be made with this VOR with whether it was going to make sense to spend $1 million on it. And then about 85% it was going to fix it. During a time when we were doing this next-in modernization, when we were trying to figure out how many of these we were going to shut off, what's the absolute minimum we needed to have. Because this old VOR navigation system is the old, like, fly with a compass in your lap kind of navigation system. The new stuff that started earlier in 2000, about 2005-ish, they were going to more purely GPS, more purely modern computer travel. They called RNAV, area navigation. All these kind of things were going on, and so they were trying to they were at a point where they couldn't keep the old way of doing stuff and then add in the new way of doing stuff. It wasn't going to be sustainable. They realized that in order to do the best for our taxpayers, we had to get rid of the older stuff as the newer things were coming in to replace that capability. Keeping the safety, keeping the multiple layers of redundancy and that kind of stuff, and that's kind of what got us to this. What we're trying to figure out, is this actually part of that minimum operating network, and is it worth spending $1 million on it? Well, we're talking about airspace here. I realize you guys can't really see this, but this is Austin Bergstrom Airport. Everyone knows where Austin is? North Carolina. Austin, Texas. There's Austin Executive Airport, and this is where the Centex VOR is. So we're talking about a pretty constrained part of airspace. In this, and this kind of show you where the waiver happened. This is the current procedure, which mirrors the old one, because they did actually eventually replace this because it wound up on that minimum operating network. But what the original condition was basically in between these red arrows, that whole arc of that VOR was gone. So all those little invisible laser pointers that were out there pointing basically south didn't work. The reason they didn't work, which is just hilarious to me, is somewhere I think about here, some Texas high school built a football stadium. Anybody seen that movie? What was that? Varsity Blue? Was that Texas football movie back in the day? That's like legit how Texas sees baseball, or sees football. And the thing is the stadium was not tall enough to warrant the FAA to evaluate it. It didn't hit the zoning, it didn't hit the obstruction requirements, so there's no reason for the FAA to look at it. But it absolutely had enough concrete and steel to cause wave propagation problems. Think of it as, in sort of a way, they put something up here that kind of affected cell towers, cell signals down here. It's kind of what happened. So that was the origin of the waiver about 20 years before we started working on this. They went out with the FAA, they said, hey, this VOR is not working. They sent some folks out there to flight check it and test it out. It didn't work. But what they did was they realized that, well, Austin Airport here, these vertical lines, these are the 2 runways. So this only applies to one. Every runway that has an instrument approach to it has what's called a missed approach. Now, the shortest flying lesson ever. The missed approach is basically a set of instructions that are all down here in the sheet that tells you, okay, if you're going to go missed, basically meaning you can't land, you need to go back up and fly. It kind of assumes you don't have a radio, nobody's talking to you, you just need to go. Because talking on the radio is the last thing you're going to do if you got especially if you're a new pilot. But the procedure requires that you go up, basically take a right, there's a climb altitude and stuff assigned to this. You hit this radial 8088 off the Centex VOR, and you follow this radial till you get to 17 miles away from it. There's a DME, basically, and there's a measuring thing in this. There's actually a display of distance from this point. The problem was that with the assumptions, like I said, assumes you don't have any radio, assumes you're just doing this off your old school instruments, there was no radial to connect onto to get to this. There were no radials down here for you to ride up to the VOR and take that right-hand turn, which is what you're actually supposed to do. So they had this waiver in place because it's Austin Bergstrom Airport. Those folks are there 24/7. Their tower's over 24/7. They fly 24/7. That's a busy, for the size of it, it's a very busy airport. So they gave them a waiver that said, hey, y'all got like 3 radar sites that overlook this place. Most of the traffic you're going to be concerned with, because it's Austin Bergstrom International Airport, is going to be commercial traffic, who's got, every airplane's got like 4 radios in it, and people who know what they're doing. They said, let's give you a waiver. So yeah, granted, you can't really use this missed approach as it's written, but what you can do is get what they call vectors from a tower, which is basically when you tell your pilot and you click the microphone button on your stick, and you tell them, hey, I'm American Airlines 231 going missed. They say, Roger, missed, and what they'll do is instead of just telling you to fly the procedure, instead of saying, hey, follow missed approach procedure, they'll say, all right, fly runway heading, climb, maintain 3,000 feet, turn, when able, turn right, 090, and they'll give you specific radar monitored instructions to tell you basically to fly, and then probably come back down and try it again. So basically, you were allowed the waiver because there were some air traffic controllers and radar systems there to hold your hand. You didn't have to do it alone. And it was extremely unlikely that you would have both an air traffic controller tower outage and have radar sites down and be losing your radios, and as a last resort inside the tower here, they actually have a light gun that they point at you, and they give you certain light signals to tell you to climb or descend or turn right, turn left, whatever. And every pilot knows how to use those. So it's a really cool thing. So if all 12 layers of backup failed and the only thing left was the procedure as written, just climb and keep your eyes out the window. Don't hit anybody. But that was the whole thing with the waiver. Now what happened when we're doing this stuff is we got this call from a senator's office. I will not mention the senator, but they flew into Austin Executive Airport. So this airport, not this one. Now you'd think with the VOR right here, you'd think that this would be kind of an intrinsic part of this airport. It's not. This VOR was probably here before that airport was built. And that airport was probably built there because that used to be a big patch of farmland that happened to be available, and some local Texas congressman knew somebody who could sell it to him for cheap or something like that. But the senator calls us and says, hey, you need to make sure this report says to spend that $1 million, because I fly my jet in and I need that VOR to work. I got to see my constituents. You got to make sure that that thing is ready for me and my pilot so we can get to where we need to go. Well, there's a little problem with that. So remember I said everything is documented, right? So, now I already told you what this one means. So, anybody, no pilots in here, right? This is what I was telling you about, like maybe, this, say RNAV means you're using GPS approaches. The slant Q means you're running a fully RNAV equipped airplane. Or in this case, a slant Q airplane that the senator is flying, because we got their tail number and we looked up what their plane was, into Austin Executive, which only has GPS approaches and does not use VORs for anything ever. Slant Q plus RNAV means senator is an idiot and a liar and probably well-intentioned. But this particular senator was well known for getting their name attached to aviation projects in Texas. Yes, sir?
That's how Kennedy died, right? He didn't have the Q. He couldn't do, he didn't have the navigation or something like that?
You're talking about Robert Kennedy?
Yeah.
He was way before this.
Okay.
This RNAV stuff didn't even really start until about 2000, 2001. But there was something. Yeah, I think he was closer to not having a VOR. He didn't have a properly, if I'm remembering correctly. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. I will be wrong again. he didn't have an instrument set up plane, so he couldn't fly unless he could see out the window. And he got into some bad weather, couldn't see out the window, had to rely on instruments that either he didn't know how to use or weren't working, and controlled flight in a train. Controlled flight in a train basically means that the person didn't realize they weren't trying to pull up or anything like that. They were just literally on the controls and right inside a mountain. Happens occasionally. I have stories. But yeah, so the senator here, the big thing, this is one of his confessions of an analyst. This is a lot of fun. It is fun telling a sitting United States senator to just shut up and color. Because when we got the information, because they gave us this big rant, they gave us a big written screed that said, you have to do this because I have this particular government-supported need to reach my constituents, all this kind of stuff. And we sent them back a report saying, based on records of this being your airplane, because they told us their airplane, you don't know what you're talking about. You're telling us you have a slant Q plane and flying to an RNAV airport. None of those use a VOR. On top of that, and I kind of emphasize the RNAV thing, and this is part of the analysts you have to know about airspace, and you have to be able to talk to controllers and all that kind of stuff. The RNAV piece of this, Austin Executive Airport doesn't have a single procedure anywhere, any way that would use a VOR. It's all GPS. If GPS don't work, you can't fly in Austin Executive Airport. Now, if GPS failed in the area, was that 40 or 4 minutes?
4 minutes.
Left?
Yeah.
Nice. We're gonna get to the first one. That's awesome. But we'll get to I'll skip to the last one. But in the event of like a full GPS failure, now that it's part of the minimum operating network, you would use the Centex VOR to land at Austin Bergstrom. Because the minimum operating network is part of that safety thing. An aircraft is safe if it is on the ground and not moving. And sort of, in a way, aviation has kind of a perfect record like that. Because we have never left one up there.
Oopsies.
So, now, I'm going to give you kind of current events. Actually, I'll give you this one really quickly, because this is kind of a fun one, and I just kind of want to see if the video plays. So, with all the routing and stuff, there's different rules over oceanic airspace, there's different rules over continental airspace, kind of mostly based on whether a radar can see you or not. If a radar can't see you, or you're not in like direct communication with air traffic control, then they have to put you several minutes apart, like about 15 minutes apart. But if you're under communication, aircraft can get as close as 3 miles. Now 3 miles at 500 miles an hour is a few seconds. 15 minutes, much safer. But it's a bandwidth problem, right? If you have to stretch everything else out to 15 minutes, then that means you can't put as many aircraft up there. Well, an analyst, let's see if this is going to play. This is an old video, and I want you to kind of pay attention down in the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, it is the Gulf of Mexico. Now this is Houston, Miami, Tampa, Orlando. Keep an eye on that Gulf of Mexico. We're not going to let this whole thing play, but keep an eye and look at the traffic in the Gulf of Mexico. Now this is a 24-hour time lapse of air traffic. So those are all actual airplanes or actual file flight plans and stuff. Obviously at this kind of distance, if those were to scale, those airplanes would be like 10 miles long. but notice, or what do you notice down there?
There's a lot moving really close together.
A lot more close together. But
Don't really fly directly over the middle of the
Right
field.
there, yeah.
yeah, not flying directly over. Which is kind of crazy if you think about it, because the Yucatan Peninsula is more or less right here, or it's actually about like right here. You'd think you'd have aircraft flying to Mexico. What you actually see if you saw the whole thing is you would see aircraft flying up Mexico, across, and then down to get to Miami, because they can put more aircraft through that area. Yeah, it's longer, burns more fuel, creates more noise pollution around the coast, all that kind of stuff, but it's safe. You can keep the smaller separation. You've got affirmative radar control of everybody. You can see where everybody's going. Well, an analyst figured this out at one point in time. There was an analyst I met them once a long, long time ago. They were working in Miami Center, and they realized like, hey, like 95% of the aircraft we have coming in here that are coming from west are coming through that route over the Gulf of Mexico. Even the ones that were coming from areas down south in Mexico that should have just gone straight across the Gulf of Mexico. So they did some digging and they coordinated and talked to people like they do, and they found out that, oh, well, of course there's no radar, and this is before all the GPS stuff. And they realized, hey, there's a way to fix this. And what we did was we looked at this thing here, we looked at this thing they call the VHF en route network. Let me back it up. VHF en route network. Now the deal was here is figure out this airway. We realized that we had groups of stakeholders. So we had, right off the top you can see we had the US FAA, we had the US government, obviously we had the Mexican government, also neighboring governments like Cuba, South America, and all these had to be coordinated. But there's a huge group of stakeholders that were an asset in this case that were being entirely overlooked. Any ideas?
The flyers.
Hmm?
The flyers.
The airplanes?
No, the people in the planes.
Nope. They're a pure benefit. As a matter of fact, most people that are in planes don't even know this exists. A lot of the pilots don't know this exists unless they fly that particular route.
Fishermen, people
Close.
on boats.
Close. Oil platforms. There are hundreds of oil platforms all over the Gulf, and they're quasi-permanent structures. Well, what do we need to fly continental separation? Radar or regular VHF radio contact. VHF radio is about this big. Power amplifier is about this big. You can put that on the top of a bookshelf in an oil platform. But you have to talk to oil platform people. And you have to set it up so that your maintenance people can fly out to the platform and take care of the equipment. So that's what we wound up doing, was realizing the analysts looked broadly and they said, okay, well, how can we make this happen? It wasn't, this can't happen, here's the rules. It was, what rules exist that we can exploit? And it turned out to be this VHF radio thing. And so they created contracts with a lot of the oil platforms in the area. Actually, in typical FAA fashion, we actually use about twice as many oil platforms and radios as we need because, well, if we have another oil platform that goes up in smoke, if that's got one of our radios on it, we can't shut that whole airspace down because that one radio's gone. We put extras out there. So there's a ton of radios out there now. So this is the same thing we just looked at. This is a newer one. This is 2016. This is afterward. If you look down the Gulf of Mexico, look at all the stuff coming right across here. You come right across the middle. Now it's going through a time cycle, so it's going into nighttime and the aircraft kind of thins out. If you actually watch over time, you'll see a big bunch of aircraft, and then it just got this big clump of aircraft kind of moves across the country as morning commuters move across. But notice, now they're flying all across the middle. It's not a super dense piece of air traffic, but now they're flying across the middle. I mean, it's obviously not like the Northeast Corridor where you can see a line here from Atlanta to New York. But yeah, so now we have a whole lot more aircraft, and these aircraft in that box are all flying at what they call continental separation. It's all flying at that 3 miles distance. So we got 45 now.
Oh, you're way past.
Okay, we're good. Okay, so now I'll give you a choice. Does anybody want to hear about the radar sites and the modernization they got going on now? I don't think they're going to kick us out of here. Everybody's got food, drinks. You may need a new beer. So this was the thing. So the whole thing with that VHF en route network was to basically take existing rules, existing equipment, and figure out a different way to configure it so you could maintain a safe and efficient use, but actually increase the availability of airspace in a given place. Now that sounds like kind of a silly thing, right? You can't create more air. You're not going to create more volume of space, but what you can do is you can create the conditions where it's safe for aircraft to be closer together. And that's what they did. Now, additionally to the benefit of that being more aircraft going through, they also use less fuel. They also produce less noise over populated wetlands and stuff along the coast. It's also shorter distances for search and rescue if they need to get there, because now all those platforms, they all have access to every single one of those oil platforms out there has some form of search and rescue equipment on it. Maybe not a helicopter or something, but at least a life raft, something like that. And they all have people with binoculars that can tell you exactly where the plane crashed. So way, way, way safer. Now, the National Airspace System has lots of moving parts, and this is where we're going to get a little bit of current events. The current thing in the NAS is they're talking about right now. This is a big thing with Duffy's. Secretary Duffy's been talking about is this, that we're gonna update the entire National Airspace System in the next 3 to 4 years. They've even put out some RFPs for it, which some of those are hilarious. Have a whole sidebar on that later. But the thing is here is one of the things that they keep talking about, and this is one of the big missing pieces, is if anybody heard one of Duffy's kind of tirades about the NAS being out of date and stuff. Yeah, latest thing, they keep talking about, oh, it's using floppy disks, and they're using copper wire, we need to make fiber. And what he's missing from that is that, especially with the copper wire thing, is it's and copper. You see, the National Airspace System, all the infrastructure National Airspace System is, by rule, unbelievably fault tolerant. A typical radar site, say like an ASR 8, ASR 9, which is, there's one actually sitting, if you look out of the window at Harrisburg Airport and you look up on the hill across the way, if you know what you're looking at, you'll see the radar site. Now, I checked when I went to the air show out there a while back and could point to the radar site from people, and some folks couldn't see it. But it was right there and it's painted orange.
I'm sorry, I just couldn't see it.
But they're all over the place. But that one radar site, is because people see a building and see an antenna. The single antenna is about the only single thing it has. It has one antenna, but inside the building, 2 full radar systems, channel A, channel B. Each of those systems has A and B power supplies in it. Super, super redundant. If one of the systems overheats and falls down, the other one's already online and just picks up. Nobody even knows. Yeah, there's an indication in the maintenance terminal in the building that it flipped channels, but the air traffic controllers don't see it. Additionally, the building where the equipment lives, and just think like a radar site's probably about ASR 9 is probably about right, more or less where Derek and Zach are here, over to this side of these tables, about the length of this room. 2 full air conditioning systems that are rated at almost twice what that building would ever need in the worst, hottest day in whatever the climate is in. Why? One system fails, the other one picks it up. Or one system gets dirty and is not keeping up capacity, the other one kicks in and helps it out. Because radar systems don't like things being hot. Anybody ever had a computer or a phone die because it got too hot? Yeah, that would kind of suck if your air traffic controller looking at a scope and a system 20 miles away went down because it was hot and you just lost all your data. You'd know, you'd get big red X across it. On top of that, there's a battery backup in the building that, regardless of air conditioning and everything, is guaranteed to keep the building operating for at least 4 hours. On top of that, there's a backup generator. This is all on the same radar site. This isn't like all over the place. This is that one radar site. The backup generator, an absolute hard minimum, is it has 72 hours of fuel in the tank at any moment in time. Meaning you get down to about 76 hours, you order some more fuel. Normally we kept about 90 hours. And that's all to keep one radar sensor up. And we're not even at the copper part yet. Most of those radar sites, even just the one here, it is sending data on fiber from the radar site to the airport. Something like an internet thing. Some of them actually use internet. They use a very, very specific secure protocol to use it, but they send their data on internet. Because certain places, the internet's low enough latency, and it might be here because it's close enough, there aren't as many switches in between. But they also use copper through a telephone network. So if the fiber goes down, you got the copper. And on top of that, if you look really close to that radar tower, there's a thing about this big. It looks kind of like a bass drum. It's pointed at the airport. It has a direct point-to-point microwave radio link. That if you lose the copper and you lose the fiber, you have a point-to-point radio link to keep the signal, keep the data going in the air traffic controllers. Because it's got to be fault tolerant. I mean, the only thing that's going to shut the system down is something that takes the antenna out entirely all in one shot, or somebody drives a truck right through the building. That would do it. But Farmer Bob out there with his backhoe digging through the fiber, it's going to upset some people, but it's not going to shut the site down. building overheats, get a bunch of wasps build a nest in one of the air conditioners, it's not gonna shut it down. It's gonna be a bad day for the technician, I know. I've had to clean those out. But the system will keep running. Because that is everything you hear in the National Airspace System, it's all built that way. It's all built that under any 99.999999% predictable situation, there's a plan for that. There's a system for that, there's a redundancy for that. And even then, that radar site is overlapped by other radar sites. So even if that site goes down, the airport itself still has some amount of radar coverage. And that's a whole lot of fun. But the National Airspace System itself has over 73,000 pieces of equipment. Or over 73,000, I should make that more specific. Has over 73,000 system installations. So we're not talking every little circuit card in the radar site. We're talking the radar site is one. There are 618 radar sites, and they've given me 4 years to do this. Now this is that part where I kind of started hearing Duffy talking about stuff. I said, you know what? Give me a spreadsheet. So I started looking at stuff, and I started looking at kind of the different radars and stuff that are out there. Yeah, the short version is if they were super good, if they were absolutely had all the logistics set up. In other words, they're ready to go right now. How many radar sites per week do you think they would have to do?
All
Pretty close. Yeah. No, they would have to be, and this is including, now keep it in mind that they can't just tear that site out and put in a new one. They have to build the new one, make sure it works, then shut this site down. So you're going to be maintaining 2 radar networks for a while. 1,200 radar sites. But if they had all the logistics ready, in other words, they had all the cards, all the chips, all the conduit, all the flex duct, everything they needed, just sitting around waiting to go, and you could do it with no shipping time. So, some magic fairy just dropped the radar components on the site and had them ready to install. You would have to do one site something like every day and a little less than a half, non-stop for 4 years. That means pouring concrete. Yeah. It gets especially fun when you think the realities, and these are the kind of things some of the analysts look at. Pennsylvania's not that cold. Not really. I have seen people have to set up those big torch things. You've seen those like big construction torch things to pour concrete on a runway in North Dakota. That was just a patch repair. That wasn't even that was a panel on a runway. It wasn't even a whole thing. Yeah, but they needed a runway, and the runway wasn't safe. They couldn't use it. They actually had a crack across it, so it wasn't safe for what they were trying to use it for. And DoD is paying for it, so that helped. But that was basically, think concrete. Like imagine that you were going to pour concrete in your driveway. Except you're using way better concrete than you're ever going to buy as a regular person. And your time to cure that concrete is about like that. You got about that much time for it to cure. Because those runway things, like before they could use the runway, it has to be cured. Which means that basically in that particular climate they had to use basically underwater concrete that cures chemically. It doesn't dry. There's a chemical reaction in it, so it's actually exothermic, it's hot. It's fun stuff. But even that, under that maximum mitigation going on, still took almost a month to be usable.
How do you double it? Dry.
What's that?
How do you double it? How
Yeah.
do you double it in concrete?
That is part of the question. Yeah, if you're pouring concrete, it's got to cure that fast. Yeah, you honestly, in real life, what you'd probably do is you'd pour the concrete, and then you would grind it down. If you're going to really do it. But if you're doing stuff that cures that fast, I'm going to want to see the grinder you're using. Because I got to see the machinery that broke up the airport, broke up the runways at Stapleton Airport, the old Denver airport. And that thing was basically picture a truck that kind of looks like a supersized tow truck. And it has this gigantic like 10-ton hydraulic guillotine in the back. They would drive out, think of They would drive out in the concrete, they'd put this thing up, raise it up, and then slam it down to try to crack the concrete. Because runaway concrete on the landing ends might be 30 feet thick. There were some explosives used. But that thing they were using to crack the concrete where it wasn't that thick, like the old taxiways and stuff, it actually registered on the Richter scale. And you could see, there's a lab out there in Colorado, and they actually put a thing on the news one time, and you could see every like 5.5 minutes where they were making a thump. Because it's got, you know, it's got its own unique characteristics. But yeah, that's crazy stuff. And we currently live in a political environment where people don't understand. And you guys actually know more about the National Airspace System right now than probably most people you know. They don't understand why it's so robust as it is. They don't understand what's required to do that. They're basically complaining that we need to tear out the stuff that makes it so safe. You know, I'm totally good. If you got something running purely copper and you've got a better way to do it, and you can do it without destroying the system, I'm good for more data, more reliability, stuff like that. Totally fine. But don't take away the copper that's there as a backup. Maybe put in a second fiber that goes to an entirely different network. Because this is the way the whole things are built. I mean, I kind of want to know what they would think if they looked at how hospital equipment's made. Or hospitals. Or the airports themselves. There's a Denver International. Denver International has 2 separate substations. It's on 2 separate power grids. There's a grid that comes in from the north, there's a grid that comes in from the south. And it can pick and choose which of those grids is going to work. And if the whole northern part of Colorado and Wyoming go offline, the airport's going to run off the part that connects to Kansas and southern Colorado. And it will stay up. Oh, and the airport still has generators. And the airport still has multiple redundant air conditioning systems, all that kind of stuff, and that's just the way it works. And we've got people around that don't understand that. So if I were going to do a call to action, I would tell you, contact your representatives and things and get them to start hiring some better analysts.
What's
Because
the backup? So you talked about the heat. What about the cold? What's the backup for the cold?
cold use is not a problem for electronic equipment, as long as it's running already. Most electronic equipment is just too hot. A lot of things, like even just a computer server kind of power rack, that computer server rack has to be cooled because of the power supply. And most computer things, as long as the power supply is running and you haven't like exploded your batteries or something because the batteries froze, that server rack itself will heat the room up.
Better usually drain cold.
Yeah, and like for things like the generators you have at the radar site, there's actually an immersion heater on the block of the engine, and the battery has a battery heating pad underneath it that keeps it at a good temperature. And they also use some of the more robust things. Like we had several ones we did in Denver. We replaced them with those spiral cell batteries, those cold start spiral cell batteries that you can almost literally freeze. You can put them in a freezer and then connect them and they'll still run. But things you won't use, lithium batteries. Nope. Lithium batteries are great for storage, but they are very temperamental. And believe it or not, we do kind of put things in there. It's not an all-cost thing. You do think about that you replace batteries periodically, so you want to do it in a way, you want to design in a way that's not going to cost you $10,000 every time you replace a battery, because you're going to be replacing 73,000 batteries. 10 grand a battery is not sustainable. But $150, $300 a battery, somewhere in that range, good. You buy those a pallet at a time. But yeah, most of the things are kept up. Like the whole systems are kept that way. Like nothing's really ever at a dead cold. If it is, before you start it up, some technician's going to go out there and look at it, check the temperature, warm the batteries up, or bring new ones or whatever. Yeah. So in the event something was actually hard down, and that the same thing would happen to the radar site. If the radar site was hard down for some period of time, they wouldn't just remotely start it back up. They'd send some technicians out there to literally run through the checklist and do all the maintenance on everything. Air conditioners, engines, everything, and make sure it was all running, make sure it was ready. So when they hit transmit and the high power transmitter comes on, it didn't, blow a bird's nest out of the duct or off the antenna or something. That would be fun. That'd be an interesting fire. All right.
I feel like we're hearing a lot of stories in the news this year about plane crashes, and we're seeing a lot of. But I've also heard that this was like worldwide. This was like one of the best years.
Yeah.
Not as many plane crashes, but it's like a huge deal now.
Yeah. Well, it's always it's kind of part of the model of media. It's that whole idea that if it bleeds, it leads, is a thing. And actually, I kind of take that, like the more you hear about them in the news, that should reinforce your sense of how safe it is. Because think about it. When's the last time you heard of a car crash in the news? Like just a routine car crash. Because it happens all the time. It's not even interesting anymore. Plane crash, especially a commercial plane crash, they're interesting every time. And honestly, every smaller plane crash gets in the news somewhere. You know, there's one down in Lancaster, I don't know, like 3 months ago, kind of landed in a nursing home parking lot and kind of slid into some cars. You know, that made the news. And that wasn't even all that particularly weird. And a lot of things like that, a lot of those kind of things, even if somebody doesn't crash, but they have to like land on a freeway because they lost their engine, even that will make the news. Because that's a big deal. So I take that, the more you hear about it, the less it happens. So that's kind of just knowing how the media works, knowing how things get reported. Now I think we hear a lot more about it because, especially with social media and the TikToks and all that kind of stuff, every Yahoo running around with a phone is all of a sudden now a press agent. And you might hear, you get the conspiracy theories, you get all kinds of weird things going on. And kind of as hopefully you got a little bit away from this evening, is a lot of folks don't know enough to know that they don't know enough. Because they see like that switch in the Air India plane. People think, how do they know where the switch positions were? Because literally the switch is wired to a box that detects what position it's in. And then it's separately wired to the thing it controls. And even if the fuel pumps or whatever it's connected to didn't work, and you sat there and flipped that switch up and down, the computer's going to say that switch was flipped up and down. And it moves grounds, which is handy because it doesn't take really any power to do that. But planes and things are made that way. They're made for the investigation. They're made so they know exactly what happened, and they've got a way to trace it and check it and find out, well, what actually did happen. In that particular one, last thing I heard was they have data that the switches were changed. Why? I don't know. It's not the first time it happened, although it's not the first time it's happened. Hopefully it'll be the last. Hopefully they'll make it a little bit harder to cut the fuel off from the engine while it's in flight. Alrighty. Well, I appreciate y'all for playing along.
Thank you very much.